Now we're going to have the committee introduce themselves. So Alex, could you do that again, please?
Alex Zimmerman, pronouns are she, her. I am on the Portland Streetcar Inc. board, the Northwest Parking Stakeholder Advisory Group, and I'm a Northwest resident.
Jordan, you're next on my list.
This is Jordan Winkler with Winkler Development Corporation. I'm an industrial property in the district, and I'm a Northwest resident.
Thanks. Mike Stonebreaker.
So Mike Stonebreaker, I'm on the NWDA board, on the Transportation Committee, liaison to the Planning Committee, and as far as I know, no conflicts of interest.
Phil, you're next.
Yes, Phil Sellinger, at-large committee member and Thurman Street resident.
I don't think Stephen is, I don't see his image here. Am I missing anything? So Stephen Ramos hopefully will join us a little bit later. Steve Pinger, you're next. And you're muted. Steve, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinger, NWDA. I own several properties in the study area.
Joy is not with us. I don't see Greg Madden yet. Jen, there's Jen. I saw her just appear on my screen. We're just doing introductions, Jen.
Yeah, hello, I'm Jen Macias. I have property and own a business in the study area.
Great. It's good to see you. I don't say Cachet. Is Dalton, has he logged in yet? I don't see Dalton Human yet, so hopefully he will join us. Craig Hamilton hopefully will join us. Reza, are you in attendance today? Don't see him right now. Raymond, you're next.
I'm Raymond Betchick, member of Friends of Portland Streetcar, Northwest resident, former member of the Citizen Streetcar Advisory Committee for Portland Streetcar, and I don't think I have any conflicts of interest.
Great, thank you, and good to see you all today. Stephanie, I saw you log in, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I am Stephanie Bassaliga. I'm a development associate with Micro Enterprise Services of Oregon, MISO. We were one of the CBOs that gathered feedback from minority and women-owned micro and small businesses in the Hollywood area. And I don't think I have any conflict of interest.
Great, thank you. And Brian, you're the last one on my list going backwards, so.
Hey there, Brian Ames. I represent the group that acquired the formerly ESCO site. We've got a lot of kids here, and I just got home from skiing 9 minutes ago, so everybody's excited.
Yeah. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'm just going to check in on a couple things. Kate, could you remind me, can you show the PowerPoint and just the agenda here? I believe we were just going to check in on a couple things. One is to make sure that everybody got the meeting notes from the last meeting or were able to watch the video. So I'm seeing heads nodding, so I think we're good on that. Were there any comments or additions or any corrections to the meeting notes that we sent out that you guys want to express today? Okay, I'm not hearing any. I watched the video again to make sure I captured the notes as well as I could. So they might be a little bit more succinct and cryptic this time since we have these on video, but so thank you for that. And then, you know, we're going to talk about the project next steps. What we're trying to do still is get a discussion draft out for public review to kind of float the idea about this potential new vision for the area and the changes that we've been talking about out there. That's not ready yet. So today we're by and large going to give you some updates on transportation elements that would be a part of that, either discussion draft or the follow-up transportation elements. And then on the land use side, we're going to give you a preview of some of the components of what we see happening in being included in the discussion draft. We don't have the complete version of it yet. But I did want to see if there were any PWG items or if anybody had anything that they wanted to bring up to put on the table before we jump into the transportation pieces. And hard for me to tell if anybody's got their hand up based on the way we're looking at this. If anybody does have anything, just speak up. Not seeing anything. So with that, you know, again, we're still aiming to get a discussion draft out soon. We thought it would be out last month. Obviously, it didn't happen, and we're still aiming to get that put together pretty quickly. Just FYI for you all, our FTA grant does have a deadline of the end of March to have a land use plan as part of a product deliverable to Metro and the FTA. So that's kind of our real hard deadline for us. We don't really want to push on that anymore. So we are working diligently to try to get that together. So sometime between now and the end of March, we'll have something out for review that's more firmed up. But we'll give you a preview of it today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk through some transportation updates.
Yeah, thanks. So today we're going to delve a lot more into the transportation side of things. First, we're going to revisit. So several of you joined us for the charrette we held last December. So thanks for that. I think we got between half and 2/3 of our members. So I do want to acknowledge that not everybody was there. So, you know, we want to kind of bring everybody up to speed. But we're going to just do a quick kind of like what we heard and how that's influenced how we're thinking about our transportation plan and district. And then the way I'm going to do this is walk you through each of some maps of different modal flows is how I'm calling it. So how we're thinking about pedestrians entering the district, how we think the bikes would circulate, move around, how autos and freight would flow. And for each of these, we have kind of some ideas of where we think the flows are, but we have some kind of like sticky issues associated with each of these modes and kind of these things we're considering. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each kind of mode and look at a map. And then we're going to have a slide that talks a little bit about some of the sticky issues that we're working on and some of the ideas that we have on how to approach those. And we want to get your feedback as well on what you think of those ideas. If there are other ideas we haven't thought about that we should explore. These are all things that are really like in the works right now. Because we're trying to do that all within about an hour, you know, I'm sure that we're not going to get to like every idea and question you have. So we're also going to have a link at the end of this segment before we get into the land use stuff with Barry, that's going to take you to like an online message board where you can enter in any comments or outstanding questions or anything you feel like we didn't get to or we didn't answer so that we can make sure we circle back to them and look at them after the meeting and make sure that we kind of flesh it out because we know this is a really rich topic and we have a lot to get through. So with that said, if we get kind of stuck on one of the modes, I might ask us to wrap up and keep moving through just so we get through them all in that hour. So
can I jump in really quickly? I would also say when we're not going to have a lot of time for discussion on the land use piece, so use that discussion board as well to comment on any land use things that you might see when we get into that part. And we do save the chats and attach those to the notes, so that's another option as well.
Yeah, we do. You can totally do it in the chat as well. This is just kind of an easier way for us to make sure that we capture outstanding questions and make sure we get back to you. So first, going back to the charrette in December. So for those that attended, we asked some kind of overarching questions, and then we had some boards with abilities to comment on maps and all of that. And so we broke them up into in different discussion groups. And so the first one was about biking, walking, and urban design within the district, and some of the overarching things that we talked about and heard from you all that attended about sort of the bike ped facilities is putting them where people want to go. So, you know, there was some talk about like, oh, should we have a Roosevelt that's kind of a park-like, you know, separated where bikes and peds go? And what we heard more is that people really want to be on main streets and access the uses there rather than kind of be tucked back in a separated setting. Another thing we heard and talked about was really the need to continue bike connections, extending the NWIM greenways. So that's like 24th and 27th that are identified in the Northwest in Motion Plan and making sure that those continue up through the district and be kind of the main portals, particularly for bikes between Vaughan and Nikolai. We heard a bit about creating walking routes and wayfinding that connect Forest Park and the river, and that being kind of an important element for creating both people that live in the district, but sort of permeating between these two resources. We heard about extending also the NIM focused, pedestrian focused routes and making sure that we build safe crossings on Vaughan, particularly where we think those peds are going to be entering the district. So we know that like a lot of peds are probably not going to choose to cross Vaughan at 23rd because of the freeway portals. So if people are really walking up to 24th or 25th or 27th or whatever, making sure that that's where we focus on some of those better crossings where the peds are going to be circulating. We heard about accessibility within the district and a real desire for wide level unobstructed sidewalks. Obviously the sidewalk coverage and quality in the district is pretty minimal right now. So we have a pretty clean slate, but we also have some issues that we'll get to when we talk about the PED specific stuff. Notes on good lighting, inviting transit stops and accessible, available accessible parking. Again, by accessible, I think we mean accessible for persons with disabilities and being able to access places on main streets. For biking, there was some various comments about looking at Nikolai for a protected bikeway on the north side. There's kind of an interesting space that currently exists that could potentially host a two-way either bikeway or a multi-use path shared with pedestrians. We'll take a closer look at that. And then again, we heard a lot about regular high quality crossings across Vaughan to make it more permeable. And these images are just some of the snapshots of the board from that day. We also had, so we had each group kind of go into a discussion and then they switched places. And so we had also kind of a sub chat about transit and vehicle flows. Some of the things that we heard from you all were about making sure we incorporate TriMet's planned future services that are in their service enhancement plan. And related to that, the fact that there isn't service down in the Squish right now, transit service. And so making sure that we talk about that and kind of think about that as part of this project as well. There were some ideas about moving line 77 to Thurman to avoid the 23rd and Vaughan intersection. There was discussion about the importance of integrating transit stops and end stations kind of into the adjacent development and making them more placemaking rather than kind of like standalone undefensible spaces that become kind of like a no man's land area. Let's see, like to see, so we saw some comments about wanting to see the streetcar parked on Wilson with two-way connections and programming at Montgomery Park. And again, kind of incorporating into the land uses in that area. We had some freight, we talked about freight and how to encourage it not to use Vaughan and to try to get freight to use Nikolai on ramps on Highway 30 and how we could better encourage that. There was, so this related to both transit and vehicle, you know, the 23rd and Vaughan is a really tricky intersection. We have a lot of thoughts, we'll get into them about how to solve that, but some of the things we heard were exploring transit only lanes or movements around 23rd and Vaughan, both northbound and southbound, kind of exploring what it would look like if we took away vehicle movements in those areas and made them transit only. Exploring other ways to alleviate transit getting stuck at that intersection through things like flyover structures or a gauntlet trek to minimize traffic interactions or just sort of other ways to explore speed and reliability of the streetcar. Lastly, improving Wardway Nikolai intersection for smoother freight movements. If we're trying to get more freight to use Nikolai, how do we get them through that intersection better? And then some comments about eliminating or upgrading frontage roads and abandoned roads, which I see a misspelling here. I saw those. I don't remember hearing that part of the conversation. So I would love if anyone was here that, okay, looks like Phil left that to hear maybe later more about what that means, because I don't totally have the context, but want to learn more about that. So with that said, I'm going to go through some of the slides as kind of how we're thinking about each of these flows and portals. Like I said, we're going to look at a slide, a map, and then the next slide we'll talk about some of the like stickier issues to do with each of these. So in this vehicle, auto and freight flows, we kind of started with the hardest ones first, rather than some of the less like the simpler, you know, pedestrian flows. So this is kind of our one of our big nuggets is trying to figure out this auto and freight flows. And so this darker, thicker line are kind of how we see freight moving through the district. So you can see it mostly follows Highway 30. These are where the two exits are. And then coming through St. Helens onto Nikolai and kind of servicing this industrial area. This thicker turquoise line are our key kind of auto flows. So you can see that, you know, ideally our autos are mostly using, you know, circulating kind of outside of the area or going north-south on 25th, which would be a new through street, or 26th. For 23rd, we have a lot of things we're considering to manage that, but the other flows would still kind of, as we've talked about this loop, have a westbound flow on York and an eastbound flow on Wilson. Here you see some thinner lines, and that speaks to some of the ideas we're exploring about reducing vehicle traffic entering Vaughan from St. Helens Road. So we have a few ideas about that. And then you can just kind of see, you know, 25th being a main portal, you know, not so much 24th as that's a greenway, and not so much 27th because that's also a greenway. So some of the sticky issues for this vehicle and freight flows and some of the things that we're kind of exploring. So again, calming Vaughan to make it more permeable. So here's two kind of levels of intervention about calming Vaughan when it comes to freight and vehicle flows. So one is no freight access to Vaughan from Wardway. So it's already, you can kind of see this photo, it's already signed that way, but there's not really any kind of like hardened infrastructure to enforce that. So that could be something that we could think about how to really ensure that trucks aren't making that right-hand turn to get on Vaughan to access the freeway at 23rd. Or a more intensive intervention would be doing a full diverter here at Wardway and Vaughan, where essentially if you are coming from Mount St. Helens Road, you would have to continue straight onto Nikolai, and you know, ideally most of the traffic we see is headed to the freeway anyway, so that would be okay. But those that are trying to access 23rd and Northwest District would basically trickle down here and then take one of the other streets that move through the district, like 26th, hopefully a future 25th, something like that, to then access the district from Nikolai. So those are kind of two levels of intensity in terms of the intervention. But the idea being that we're trying to remove that traffic from further north and west off of that, so that Vaughan is really handling the trips from within the district and kind of the adjacent northwest neighborhood. Bigger one, another kind of big move is trying to figure out not overloading that 23rd and Vaughan on-ramp and ensuring transit reliability around and through that intersection. And so, you know, some of the ideas that we've been toying with, the bigger issue that we've seen in our demand modeling, and it's not a fatal flaw, it's not a broken intersection in 2040. We see that we still have some capacity, but we want to be proactive about it, is this southbound movement. So if you're driving south on 23rd, you know, right now there's a left-hand turn to get onto the freeway, or you can go straight, or you can, you know, make a right-hand turn to go west onto Vaughan. And so one idea is removing the left turn onto the on-ramp on the freeway at 23rd southbound. So that would allow us to potentially route the streetcar through that middle lane. It would take away one of the parts of the signal cycle, which would mean that the streetcar and transit would have more green time. It would be a shorter cycle. So those are all positives for the transit reliability. It does mean that folks wanting to get on the on-ramp there would need to, again, access either Nikolai or Vaughan, you know, further up, or they would need to go, you know, Wilson through and do kind of like the jog handle movement. A more, like the other option, a more aggressive thing that we are looking at is it could be that, whoops, it's missing a 2 there. You know, 23rd Avenue is northbound only for vehicles between Vaughan, York, and Wilson. So for those 2 blocks, there's no southbound movement. So in addition to just taking away the left turn, maybe we take away the left turn and the through movements. And so it's really just transit during those blocks. So if you were coming down Wilson, you could, again, continue straight and access the Northwest District that way through the new jug handle. Or if you were trying to get on the freeway, again, you would either go left up to Nikolai, or you would further, you know, where those trips are coming further west, you would exit at, you know, 26th, 25th, 24th, something like that to get onto Vaughn to then get on the on-ramp. So those are, again, two different kind of mitigation levels, things that we are exploring just through modeling and would love to hear your feedback on. And then the other kind of sticky issue for vehicle and freight flows are kind of what I've been alluding to, which is encouraging internal trips to exit the district to the north onto Nikolai and use those portals, or to use 26th or 25th to get onto Vaughn, to use that to access the freeway at that point. And so, you know, we're looking at using signals to encourage those movements, doing restricted right turn onto 23rd from Wilson, having signage and wayfinding that would, you know, warn people and direct people how to access Highway 30 and I-405 through those various things. So again, I'm gonna pause, although it took me a while to get through all that, and see if people have some feedback on this. It's a lot of pretty big ideas, big changes.
What's the best way to do that, Kate?
I think right now, if folks, I mean, I know we don't want to like get too stuck on this, but this is probably one of the juggernaut slide, I guess, for the biggest issues. So I'm fine with, you know, doing that. And I see Phil is raising your hand. And I just want to pause. Is Mike, are you taking notes or?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, my comments pretty limited. There's a lot of things in here, and if you did them all together, obviously the effect would be pretty significant. It's hard to comprehend exactly what that does to traffic coming out of the middle of the district, like 25th and 26th, or 26th. Do you have any information on how the streetcar actually performs, given these strategies getting through that crazy intersection?
Well, so, I mean, we have done the demand modeling without the streetcar. Right now, you know, the streetcar is in those models, it would be running in the shared lane. So it would perform about the same as the other kind of existing traffic. And so we know that there is anticipated some congestion and, you know, your 2040 with the traffic without any intervention on, again, that southbound lane. Right now, we're working on kind of modeling these different ideas to see what the, you know, anticipated difference would be in terms of how the vehicles circulate through the district. And I think, you know, the fewer vehicles we can get out of the way at that intersection and the shorter, you know, cycle length, the better it's going to perform.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Steve, your hand was up, Inger.
Could you go back to the diagram?
Yes.
So I'm just trying to understand. You're showing automotive portals to the south at 25th and 26th.
I think that so right now, you know, 25th exists for this one link, but doesn't go all the way up. So that would be, you know, a new street we would be hoping to add as we develop this area. But yes, we would want folks to use either 26th or 25th, particularly because we know a lot of the trips are going to be coming from this area of Montgomery Park and kind of this higher density ESCO area. So we would, ideally people would either go out here, go out here, or go left to go right up to the on-ramps here.
Okay. Do you have any idea in your modeling what sort of impact that would have on the volumes, on existing volumes on 25th?
On 25th?
Mm-hmm.
Right here. So 25th doesn't exist today in this area. This would be a new.
No, I understand that.
Right. Oh, so for that link.
I think Steve means like the section south of Vaughn.
Southbound on Vaughn.
Oh, yeah. South on Vaughn.
Making some assumptions about the densities in this area.
Yeah, that should show up in the modeling. So I'm sorry we don't have the modeling done for this presentation. These are kind of the new ideas we're working with, but we are modeling these ideas for making these portals, and it will show up, you know, it'll capture the added trips to 25th. So we should be able to see that.
When would that sort of modeling be done, do you think?
Our modeler is working on it right now, so I think it's going to be done in the next few weeks.
Okay.
I would hope, like, I would think that most trips originating in this area are probably, you know, they could be going south into the Northwest District, but I think that most of them will show that they're leaving the district one of these ways. But yeah, if we do reduce 23rd as a way to get into, you know, this southern area, then yeah, I think we would see some increased trips if people are planning to go, you know, to visit things on Thurman or something.
So that
yes.
that would be included in the discussion draft.
Yeah, and the discussion draft that Barry's mentioning has some initial transportation ideas that it won't have the full, like the transportation analysis and memo and planning will have it will be a separate document as well that has a lot more in-depth information. So there'll be some initial information about the modeling we've done thus far and some of the engineering work on the different streetcar alignments in that land use discussion draft, but it won't be. But we have another, like the full transportation analysis is going to be in a different report because we are behind, you know, we're following in the process that we're a little bit behind. So
it just seems like that would be an important part of a discussion draft, to have some idea of what the impacts are in the neighborhood.
Yeah, we probably won't have that for that one though, Steve. But good point, well taken. I saw Stephen Ramos has had his hand up for a while too.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks a lot. I have essentially 2 points to make. One is following up on Steve's observation and looking at the map here. One is, I should point out that 26 southbound terminates at, Raleigh. So you know, to the extent you're going to be using 26 southbound, now you're going to create other issues. And then also looking at the key automobile traffic flow off of Route 30. I'm not sure what you're trying to depict here, but basically those vehicles evaporate. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, especially since the traffic flow from there and into the neighborhood was one of the prime drivers for the Northwest in Motion changes. So those two aspects of this map, from a neighborhood standpoint, I'm hoping will be addressed in the near future, because those are huge for us. My other point is kind of an overall point to Kate's presentation, and I apologize, I missed the very, very introduction. So, but my takeaway from this is that the overall issue that we've been looking at is the congestion and constriction at the 23rd and Vaughan intersection, even before introduction of the streetcar. Then the introduction of streetcar, you know, raised that to a higher priority, obviously. And the responses, and I think properly characterize them as interventions, essentially say, well, you know, I hate to phrase it this way, but we were asked to look at, you know, what's the impact of the development and adding the streetcar to this intersection. And the responses are basically, well, get everything else out of the way. You know, get the trucks and cars out of the way of the streetcar. And I'm not sure that's a very realistic response. So I find it a little problematic because I don't think it actually solves the problem. Again, the cars and vehicles and trucks are just going to disappear, so they don't evaporate. So those are my 2 points, one specific and one broad. Thanks.
I see Alex has her hand up as well.
Yeah, thank you. I just kind of want to agree with what was said earlier. I would be really interested in seeing the modeling and then thinking further ahead what mitigations might need to be done in the neighborhood. You know, and I know you all are aware that there'll be some work coming down the pipeline for Northwest in Motion, but you know, how might things need to be changed? How might monitoring and evaluation be impacted by some of that? And I'm wondering, you know, kind of like what Stephen was saying, to assume that we can get all of the motor vehicle traffic out of the way might be a tiny bit optimistic. I do agree with Phil that if we did combine kind of all of those interventions, it would probably be more successful than to just do it piecemeal. But, you know, based on the amount of development that we're seeing, I don't know how far ahead we can get of that, you know, and so I don't want to be too negative about it, but it may not be that easy to prevent people from going southbound into the district. And so I think, you know, for this group to be comfortable commenting on a discussion draft, we do need to see more about the modeling, about the mitigation, to get the rest of the neighborhood on board. I don't see how we could move forward on, you know, unfortunately March is pretty close. So I think as fast as you can possibly work and communicate in between meetings and work sessions would be great. If we need to do another charrette, maybe. And then this is something that we can't really include in the scope, but just thinking farther down the line about tolling, that might be the only way to keep folks from coming in at peak times or exiting southbound or exiting into the residential area. And that's not really something that's going to fit in this scope, but if there is room to kind of, you know, think about potential future strategies that could make what you're proposing even more successful, or what you're proposing could be interim strategies on the way to something like, you know, peak hour pricing. You know, also we haven't really talked about whether or not the parking district will be extended up to here or if this will sort of be its own area. So all of those things need to really be explored at some point, I think, because we can't just assume that folks will stop driving in and out of the area. So that's all.
Yeah, absolutely. To that point, we do have a task for our consultants to work on transportation demand management strategies. So I think we can explore some of those strategies like you're talking about, both parking and pricing and other ways to try to control or to manage demand in the area. I hear all of the points about the concern, and we will look at the modeling and figure out, you know, how many of those trips generated in the district are, you know, does the model show moving further south into the neighborhood and what streets are they using? And you know, when we did our initial demand modeling, again, we don't show that the new trips caused in the development are going to, you know, out and out break the system. I think we're more concerned about, one, we want to be conservative. So we want to assume, you know, that we need to do mitigation regardless, even if we're still within our standards. But two, like you said, we are focused on both the reliability of the transit if we're going to put it in there, and we want to make sure it stays on time. Okay, I'm going to keep moving to our next slides so we can try to stay on time. Again, we can talk more about this with the comment board. So the transit flows, I mean, this is just really showing our existing bus lines as they operate. You can see that they're really, as was brought up in the charrette, there aren't really any in the squish right now. And other than on 27th, most of the transit currently kind of operates outside of the district. And then, you know, the streetcar, you know, as we've mentioned, we're envisioning on Wilson and York. And so this loop. And so some of the issues, the sticky issues, I guess, that we're thinking about for transit, you know, a big one being the streetcar alignment within the ESCO site. So, you know, we've been showing this York Wilson 26th Avenue loop as kind of the best operationally. We heard in the charrette an interest on parking in front of Montgomery Park and integrating with the programming there. So something like potentially a loop with a tail track that goes up Wilson to 27th. Or we saw comments with interest in a two-way in and out on Wilson. And so these are all things that we've done, you know, some initial work, streetcar engineering work to try to see what's feasible. You know, some are more feasible than others in terms of cost and utilities. Some have more reliability issues than others, but it's something that, again, we're still exploring, and along with that, with the modeling, figuring out how these different alignments within ESCO or Montgomery Park area, how that would impact, again, the traffic circulation and the bike circulation in terms of limited right of way. So these are things we're looking into. This new complementary, whether it's new or complementary bus service plan for MP and ESCO. So this kind of gets to that comment we heard too about integrating with TriMet service area or service expansion plan. These ideas of, do we continue the line 77 on Northwest Thurman up further? Do we keep line 15 internal or external to the site? Like, do we want more overlap within the district, or do we want it to be more complementary outside of it? Let's see, identifying future recommended bus lines into the squish is another issue. And then this connectivity between transit services and other modes. And so the idea of an intermodal transit hub and the idea of focusing on frequency and interlining with the bus and, shared stops on 23rd and kind of figuring out if transit and streetcar would serve people best if it were interlined so there's more frequency, or if there was better to be more coverage and that the intermodal hubs kind of are the connection places, but otherwise they're really kind of servicing different areas of the district. So I will pause there and give us just a few minutes to talk about this one. Yeah, Phil?
As I mentioned in the chat, line 15 on Thurman's likely to go away this fall and be replaced with a very minimal service to Lincoln High School for school kids. So pulling line 15 into the study area, into the heart of the study area, is desirable from kind of a complementary TOD standpoint, but on the other hand, people in the traditional residential part of the neighborhood won't have any service except for on 23rd and whatever line 15 or 77 continues to provide. So it comes back to, I think, what Reza and I have both said, we need to take a holistic look at the whole transit picture. And I think you guys are trying to do that. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I saw Steve had his hand up. I'm not sure. Steve Pinger.
Yeah, I think it might have not gone down from last time.
Oh, good. Okay.
Kate, my apologies there. I had to take a phone call. If there's any streetcar questions, just let me know.
Anybody else on this one? No?
Okay, I'm going to keep moving then. So key bicycle flows, we actually have two maps for this. The first one is flows, and the second one is some ideas around facility types. So this is really building on both the Northwest in Motion plan and some previous, the TSP, bicycle city bikeways plans within our transportation system plan. So you can see the 18th, 19th flows kind of coming in the district from the southern or the easternmost area. Also, front is another way that people get out that way. We, are kind of contemplating whether we want to use Vaughan to link up to these York-Wilson roadways, or we have this new kind of link that's been built, this diagonal. So that's another way that it could be, bikes could flow and enter in the district that way. We do continue to still like the idea of this York-Wilson couplet for bike flows. So west and then back east. There's 24th, so that's a major greenway in WIM, and we would want to continue that up again all the way through the district, potentially to access Nikolai. Nikolai is kind of you'll see one of our sticky issues because, we want it to be more of a freight street, but it also does have this existing kind of weird right-of-way space that could be useful for a two-way protected cycle track or multi-use path. Long identified in kind of our city plans is that having that project. So there's that, but there's also bike lanes on Vaughan that are used frequently to access St. Helens Road and kind of points north and St. John's and all that. So and then finally there's 27th. So we kind of see this as a major flow as a greenway as well, both south and north. And so, bikes coming this way, and then if they're coming from Helens Road, they're probably coming up here and then entering either, going south or coming this way and going south or going into the district this way. or they could stick on Nikolai. All overflows. So this map is showing some ideas of what the facilities would be like on those. You know, again, if we go with a circulation plan where these are, where this is a couplet in terms of east and west bound movements, then we would like to have a protected bike lane. There would be enough space for that on those kind of main streets. 24th, we still see is, again, an extension of those greenway treatments. Same on 27th. This Nikolai, like I said, there's that kind of off-street protected cycle track or multi-use path or something of that nature. And then here we have a bike lane as it exists today. And it's kind of a question on whether we think it's still useful to have that bike lane there if we have these other ones. So the sticky issues. So Northwest Vaughan, what to do about that? We, you know, we have some lanes today. They're, you know, just like your standard 4-foot bike lane next to parked cars in a lot of instances. So do we think it's better to invest in nearby low stress parallel facilities? Or is there value in keeping the lanes on Vaughan, particularly up to 27th, whereas there's that greenway where people might be coming from St. Helens Road and want to turn off either into the district or point south on that 27th greenway. Do we want to make it much higher quality and remove parking and create some sort of protected bike lane on Vaughan? You know, that's another option. Other issues for the bike, there are right-of-way constraints within the district. This photo of Wilson, you can see this block was rebuilt recently with Red Fox Commons, and there are 2 very large bioswales that kind of jut out into the roadway, and you can see there's parking in the shadow of those. So, you know, that's something that we have some constrained right away in terms of having bikes there, or like a protected, parking protected lane because of this bioswales. This is really only an issue on 1 block, so that's a good news. But there's also like loading docks on York that many of you know about. So these are just kind of things that would impact some of the designs. And then the connection to Northwest St. Helens Road and the industrial areas. Again, there's the potential for the Nikolai cycle track, but we would need to get people across Nikolai in order to access that because the space is really on the north side. So that would call for signals really to get people across this heavy freight corridor. Or there's this idea of, if we didn't have Nikolai, do we do something like a 2-way facility on Wardway between 27th and Nikolai to try to, again, make that connection from people coming from points north, west, and then having this 2-way facility up to 27th where those greenway hits. So that's kind of another idea, a higher intensity kind of intervention.
Kate, I see Alex has had her hand up for a while with a question.
Oh, okay.
Comment.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I keep looking at your screen.
Thank you. Kate, can you go back a slide or 2?
Yep.
Yes, yeah, the facility design. So am I seeing that right? That it would be on Nikolai a buffered bike lane? Are we talking about a paint buffer? Then switching to a trail, so that would be a 2-way cycle track facility, or something similar. What would we be seeing?
Yeah,
in that
I
area?
think, and maybe Mike can answer this. So I think that is there a buffered lane today, or is that just based on the city recommended city bikeway standard?
So I don't, there's on Nikolai today, there's this like paved over railway. And if you've been up there, you've seen it. And I think that has captured kind of our imagination in terms of converting that to some kind of like trail, like 2-way cycle track experience, right? It's almost kind of just sitting there waiting for a modification. And so we see that as like a really good opportunity to provide a really high quality bike experience on an otherwise pretty busy freight street. Alex, were you asking like further northwest, like past?
You're asking why it doesn't extend all the way to Highway 30?
Well, that, and then also, I would be concerned about you know, being on front and then heading westbound on a bike with just a painted buffer. So, you know, leaving kind of that relative comfort of front to go across to hopefully get to another comfortable facility. I'm surprised at just kind of the lack of protected bike lanes that I'm seeing on here, just because we do have a lot of really fast moving traffic in that area. Obviously behavior will change eventually, but those are some big roads, and we have had some crashes, some fatal crashes in that area in the past 5 years or so. So I would just, you know, encourage you to look at more protection, especially since this area is not that well built out yet. You really do have the room. And then just kind of curious about how, you know, on Wilson and York, where, you know, you're saying that you have some constraints with bioswales, but that would be a bike facility, but also sharing the same right of way as the streetcar tracks. And so just wondering kind of how that would all fit.
Jump in on the first
I can
question,
address
Kate.
that. I was going to say, well, yeah, Julia, I saw you and yourself. So if you want to go back to the first part of that.
Sure. And the first question, Alex, the idea here is that rather than routing folks who are on front straight down Nikolai, we see it as a more comfortable, that we can create a more comfortable, safe bike experience if they, if folks traveling on bike from front start on, yeah, exactly. Kate's doing the route with her with her cursor there. So routing folks around, and it would go the same way the other direction, routing folks around the intersection of Nikolai and 30, so that we're not sending bikes over that highway interchange, because it's a safer connected experience.
Okay. I mean, I'm curious too about that earlier suggestion to move freight to Nikolai, and then suggesting that we try to create this bridge to a comfortable trail-like experience, and how those things can coexist.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it's kind of awkward because we do want this to be more of a freight street, and it is today, and we've got all these freight uses north of here, and there's an interchange. It's, you know, this is here because there is this weird space that exists with this paved over railway that kind of lends itself, it's already there. And, you know, I know, you know, Roger at Peabody, like he's really excited about it. So I think it's something we don't want to take off the table yet. It's just, it's another thing we're exploring, but I do agree with you in a lot of ways, Alex, that like, if we're making this the freight street, we, you know, don't necessarily like want to encourage people to go up to that street as their main connection, but you know, it's worth exploring. And if we were to build it, as Julia said, I think we would have it in that space, and that space I don't think extends all the way down here anyway. So I think it would make more sense to then route people through the district this way and then back to front. To the second part of your question about the shared space in the bioswales. So if we have vehicle circulation and bike circulation as a couplet, then I think we do have enough right-of-way space that we would not have to have bikes in the same shared space as either vehicles or the streetcar. There's enough space for that. If we try to do two-way vehicle traffic on one of the streets and add a streetcar in there, it kind of depends. If it were two-way traffic with two streetcars going each direction, then they could exist in those two lanes and there would be enough space to separate the bikes. But if there was, you know, a streetcar going bi-directional on a track, then you can't, you know, put it in the same lane as traffic anymore, right? So then you need to add lanes. So then it becomes untenable if you've got a two-way streetcar track and two directions of traffic, because then you're at, you know, 30 feet, and where those bioswales are 30 feet across. So then your bikes are shared. So really the way around that is to either have the bikes share the lane with vehicles, but not streetcar for those blocks, or to do the couplet circulation, in which case you can separate all of those users. So those are the, you know, the things that we're considering.
Right, that makes sense. You know, I guess I would just say that bikes and streetcar tracks don't mix well, and so to just keep that at the forefront. I think the couplet makes sense.
For sure. And I don't think there's any I shouldn't say never, but there's none of the cross sections we're considering today have bikes and streetcars in the same lanes because of those track issues. Okay, we're at 4.6. So, oh, sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
I was just going to say, is there any, has there been any thought to developing kind of a hub for freight in the area rather than having just freight access to all the parts of the industrial area, looking at creating a drop-off zone and then using smaller vehicles to bring them to specific work sites?
We haven't talked about that. That's a really interesting idea.
Okay. Yeah, just as far as freight's concerned, far as freight is concerned, I think we need to be looking at hubs and then using things like, the UPS pilot that they did with the e-cargo trike, things like that. So I would love to see just some thought to how we could provide a route for freight, but also provide some acknowledgement of the fact that this area is developing into mixed use. And so those things may not play very well together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to keep moving unless Raymond, I can't tell if your hand is up or if you're just resting your hand. Okay, no. Okay, cool. Okay, so we kind of talked about the sticky issues.
I've had my hand up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I'll try and make this quick, but if you could go back to the bike.
The facility or the flow?
Yeah, that's fine. Either one. Okay. I would just amplify, I think, what other people are saying, and they're saying in the chat that, my own view is that some of this just seems really forced. Why in the world would you have a bike lane on a freight street? Why in the world would you have it on a street with streetcar traffic on it? I mean, it just seems like it's really forcing the issue. The other thing I would say is the entire area to the north and west of Highway 30 shows a fairly intensive routing through there when, to my knowledge, there's virtually no generation of traffic in that area. So I think it would be important to have a better understanding of what destinations are.
Of bicycle traffic? Bicycle traffic, okay.
Bicycle traffic, correct. Yeah. What the destinations for bicycle traffic are, because I don't know, where do you go out front? And finally, I don't understand why there isn't a connection at 17th. 17th to front, since the cross is there, and why it would want to wiggle through to the north and west instead of making a more direct connection off of 18th and 19th via 17th. That's all.
Okay, yeah, people could definitely turn off, go there.
I mean, this just seems like it's too much and too forced.
Okay.
To me, but.
Yeah. I hear you. Okay. Yeah, I think those are good points. Just for the destinations, I think the flows are based mostly on destinations to St. John's Bridge and out to Sauvie Island and kind of out just Highway 30 in terms of riding that direction. But
those are pretty experienced riders that don't need a lot of protection, I don't think. I mean, I don't think you find occasional riders heading out that way, but it just, you understand my point.
Yes. Okay. All right. Let's talk quickly about pedestrian flows and issues. So pedestrians, we see mostly are more, less choosy. They kind of walk all over the place. So you'll see a lot more of this. And we try obviously not to get pedestrians to go as far out of direction for them since it's more work. So you see pedestrians on most of these streets here. I think the exception is, again, on 23rd at that kind of freeway portal. We don't see there probably being a lot of pedestrians trying to cross at that point. I mean, they certainly could, and we would have sidewalks, but I think ideally we would want people to, if they're coming down 23rd to kind of, if they're going into the district to wiggle their way up either on 24th to Greenway, 25th, kind of all of these other nice neighborhood portals off of Thurman or Upshur. We see people going to Maclay Park over here within the district, kind of on all of these streets, northwest, north, south, and east, west. You can see this little wiggle speaks to some of the plans that Montgomery Park has to have permeability in their site there with the potential bridge across Wardway to access Maclay Park. So that's something that they're envisioning in their development. So that's kind of what that wiggle is how we would get people. That's kind of one of the paths to the park. And then you can kind of see this other flow again to access the river. So those are, I think, pretty straightforward in terms of and these are just showing if pedestrians were coming up to Nikolai, we would want them to cross at those intersections. So some of the sticky issues is kind of what we do with Northwest 23rd between Thurman and Wilson. If we want to emphasize 24th, 25th, but kind of these other pedestrian portals, how do we get people to use those streets? Or do we focus improvements on 23rd in this area on just kind of the west side of the street, since the east side is again, those kind of freeway portal on ramps and off ramps. For the Vaughan streetscape environment, this is something we've heard a lot about, wanting Vaughan to be a much more permeable street to kind of tie the two districts together. So thinking about how we could add medians or curb extensions or street trees, or potentially more on-street parking, which require moving the bike lane, but might make the sidewalks feel more comfortable if you're walking. So these are trade-offs, obviously, but things that could potentially both calm Vaughan and make it easier to cross. The York loading dock. So this is kind of an accessibility area. It's neat because we have this, interesting kind of urban design with these loading docks. And obviously it's pretty, reminiscent of Northwest 13th. And so is this something that, would want to preserve to kind of like hold on to that history of the district and kind of that uniqueness, but then, if we have accessibility issues, in the area, do we then make kind of a secondary walking space alongside that? Just kind of how we deal with the accessibility areas around that. And then Nikolai, on the south side, we have extremely narrow sidewalks adjacent to very fast moving large traffic. You can see in this photo, it's even more challenging because we have these properties that are kind of right up on the sidewalk. So there's not really space to try to like buy right away at the back of curb, because the back of curb is a building and they're unlikely to redevelop anytime soon. And so, do we just close these sidewalks and say you need to cross and walk on the north side of Nikolai, and maybe it's on that, higher quality facility? Do we, say that we want to move the curb into the street to try to get more sidewalk access, but then that means shifting the entire kind of road bed further north because we only have 3 lanes here as exists today. So that would be a pretty major and expensive thing to do. But again, these current sidewalks don't meet any standard by any means. So that's an issue. Yes, Phil.
I agree with all the points. I just want to look back at the second point in the first box about Northwest 23rd at Vaughan. I wouldn't write off that intersection for pedestrians. I realize you're competing with signal cycle time, but the streetcar's got to get straight across that intersection. And I think a crossing on the west side would be important. There's a development which is taking forever to get completed there, but also the Aramark site will probably redevelop to something interesting. And I think 23rd Avenue, is always going to be an active location. The library's right there. So I'd still like to see how to make that 23rd and Vaughan intersection civilized for all modes.
Yeah, good points. Steve?
I agree with Phil entirely on that. And I also believe there was quite a bit of recent investment in pedestrian crossings, both east and west side of 23rd at that intersection. So it seems funny to walk away from it now. The second point I would want to make is, it seems like the 13th Avenue in the Pearl model is probably possibly more appropriate here, where you have a very, very generalized curbless environment in which the sidewalks are the middle of the street sometime. You know, people walk where they can and cars drive where they can, and that seems to be okay.
Yeah, Alex?
Yeah, I guess I would say, you know, when comparing that area to 13th, it's not really ideal to not have some guidance for folks. Right now, there's some nice closed areas where the restaurants have been encouraged to use the street space. And so I wonder if that could be looked at here, just kind of what the options for programming would be in kind of a do nothing scenario to the street versus having more of a streetscape, and just kind of thinking like a little bit further down the line about what else might develop in the area. So which one could be more useful to plan for.
Mm-hmm.
And then just sort of a general comment, because this area is a little bit underbuilt. Are we thinking ahead about SDCs and kind of preparing, you know, lists of projects to make it easy for developers to see how that money would be invested back into the neighborhood, tying it to specific pieces of that? You know, I realize that that's further down the line, but since this is all going to kind of go hand in hand with the redevelopment, thinking about how to engage the private sector a little bit more when they're coming into the conversation, rather than have them come in and start planning and then realize that they're beholden to build something, or they could have built something.
Yeah, so this, you know, this project will have a district transportation plan, which will have cross sections, or at least suggested cross sections and some level of specificity. If that is then passed by council, I think our development review folks would use that as a resource when areas redevelop and coming in and talking about what they need to build and to what standards. Mauricio can, or Barry, or someone can correct me if I'm misrepresenting these, but
yeah, that's what I'm wondering, is the difference between, you know, we're suggesting that you build this and this is a standard, because we can suggest all we want, and it won't necessarily happen. So more of a standards conversation for that.
Yeah, Mauricio, can you speak to like what level of surety is assured by passing?
Yeah, good questions. I think the intent is something that we want to get to. I'm not sure we have all the products that we can deliver at this time. You know, the Pearl District took 3-4 plans to get to the space in which we could have a right-of-way standards. Yeah. So at this point, we need to play around with a concept, zoning changes, action items. That could be one, develop a right-of-way standards for the area. It could be a parking action item. There could be more, you know, we won't be able to provide the infrastructure right away either. So this concept needs to be, we need to agree to something that is great and talks to the rest of the areas. But we need to also come up with a pathway, a blueprint for how to continue to engage in this area as it redevelops. I think some of the property owners need flexibility as they grow, and we need to be able to understand how to accommodate that growth and what time do we provide the next level of investment. So there's a lot to talk about. So at this point, it's good to talk about it. I cannot quite commit that we'll get to that level, Alex, but the intent would be to get to something as we move forward.
And yeah, Mauricio / Dan may be able to say this more, but you know, if the property owners decide to, you know, through this development agreement and zoning changes and everything, if they decide to vote to enact an LID on their properties, you know, I think we would hope that part of that money would be used to pay for a streetcar, but could it, I mean, I imagine it could also be used to pay for these other kind of street improvements as well, right? Yes, Dan's nodding.
That's correct.
I'm nodding too.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think hopefully that would help to also pay for some of these identified projects. Okay, anybody else who we haven't heard from on this before we move on? We have 4 minutes before it's Barry's turn. No? Okay, so I apologize. since I'm showing, I haven't been able to read any of the chat. So if I missed anything, we'll look back at that. But I'm putting up on the screen, and hopefully Mike or someone can put in the chat this link, this bit.ly link. It's not spam. It will take you to this website, this comment box that, again, if there's anything we didn't get to or you felt shy about bringing up, you can leave that there and we'll have the record for our notes and we can kind of circle back on. And like Barry said, if you have comments on his presentation of the land use and economic Northwest stuff, you can also add them in this same screen transportation comment box that once you click on it, you can have separate and open. So that I am going to turn it over to Barry and note that we didn't even run over.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, good job all.
Yeah, so I don't think we need to have the slide up right at the moment. We'll jump back in. You could just stop sharing for a minute, I guess. Well, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in since while Kate's working on the there we go. Because I know, so we're going to cover a little bit of the land use pieces that we're planning to include in the discussion draft to kind of frame up, you know, put more solidity to what a land use proposal might look like. It's not fully cooked yet, so it's a work in progress at this point in time, but it's getting closer. So we want to share some of that with you. And we're also at the point where we've got we're getting updated documents from the consultant team, both from Perkins and Will on the urban design framework and that concept document, which has the 3 initial scenarios, the hybrid scenario, and a little bit more work and detail on some other design issues in that. So we're reviewing that with staff right now, and that'll be attached to the discussion draft as well as an appendix. We're also just received an updated opportunities and challenges report and some ancillary work from Eco Northwest on the economics and the jobs and the housing and all of that. And I wanted to invite Tyler Bump from Eco Northwest to talk a little bit about some of his, you know, kind of high level findings in this updated report, because that'll be critical to, you know, our thinking about. I think we're still on track with a hybrid scenario. He could talk a little bit about what works and what doesn't work on that, but it'll also be critical to our thinking about, you know, how we start to think about, you know, what is available for public benefits and how does that pie get sliced up? So, Tyler, do you want to go ahead and jump on in?
Sure, I can jump in. And hi, everyone. Nice to see you all again on the computer screen. As Barry mentioned, I just want to give a few quick updates. I have 3 different sort of points I'm going to talk through. One is some updates since we last shared the preliminary results with you. It's been a couple months. We've done a lot of refinement work since then, so we just want to share with you what we've done, and then talk about an overview of the results, and then talk about next steps and sort of what we're doing in getting Barry the final report for the appendix, as he mentioned, to the staff report. So I'll start off with the updates since preliminary results. We've really been in, I would just call it sort of refinement mode of refining the analysis and digging a little deeper at things that we're sort of poking out to make sure that we're sort of characterizing the outcomes and the opportunities correctly. One, as we talked about before, the really large sites in the study area have a big impact on the overall results between the scenarios. So one of the things we really wanted to do was to dig into some of those bigger sites more specifically and address some of the scaling issues of development prototypes relative to parcel size. And we've also been working sort of in lockstep with Perkins and Will as they've been refining their urban design work as part of this as well. So we've got some changes to the sort of site pattern with some of larger sites and thinking a little bit differently there or more refined there. One of the other things that we've done as we're getting a better handle on impacts is thinking about sort of the back end of COVID and what that means for both Portland and Northwest and the study area here as well. So we have made some sort of modifications to make sure that we're accounting for near and midterm headwinds really in the commercial market and how that relates to the opportunities in the study area and some of these opportunity sites as well. And then we've been drilling down on some of the more opportunity sites, the sites that are really popping up as as being critical to the results, where there's a lot of likelihood of development, high likelihood of development for different types. And so digging in and making sure that we're getting those right. One more piece that we've done is we started doing some sort of sensitivity testing on the development types for mixed use development within the FAR allowances that we were looking at. So what currently we were kind of modeling as the EX zone in the sort of core of the study area at ESCO and Montgomery Park, and then also some around in between 23rd and 21st over by York, and wanted to sort of test out this idea of allowing additional height to take advantage of the FAR over there. So we looked at a 7-story building, which is a little bit bigger than the 65-foot height, but maintains the same FAR. And so we've done a little bit of sensitivity there as well. In terms of results, thematically, nothing has really changed from what we talked about before. The hybrid scenario, the hybrid enhanced industrial mixed use scenario still sort of performs, quote unquote, the best for some of the things that we had talked about last time of thinking about industrial job preservation in certain parts of the study area, thinking about how to really leverage transit investment to support more activity, be that both commercial, retail, office, and housing. And so the hybrid industrial mixed use really continues to perform the best. And one of the other things that we're looking at, of course, in the public benefits discussion that Barry mentioned is the sort of total value created that could theoretically be captured for public benefits. That's one of the other things we're looking at. So the hybrid industrial mixed use scenario still performs, again, depending on your view, better than some of the other scenarios that we looked at based on the conversations that we had. But the overall scale of the impact has changed because of the refinements that we're making. So there's some changes in the overall numbers, but the relationship between the scenarios and how they performed is all staying the same. In terms of next steps, we're really wrapping up last final edits to our opportunities and challenges report with BPS and PBOT staff. We had another conversation this morning on final edits, and we'll be wrapping that up and getting to them pretty soon so they can publish that as an appendix to the staff report. So that's a quick update, and so I wanted to open it up for questions since it's been a while since we've all had a chance to chat.
Any questions for Tyler at this point in time? We will be sharing that report when we publish the discussion draft and sharing it with you all. I think you will see, as Tyler said, some changes in the overall, jobs, the jobs numbers, the housing numbers, and the valuation numbers, but the relationships are very similar. Okay, I guess we're good. So I'm going to go ahead and walk you through some of the land use pieces then that we're talking about for the discussion draft. Some of them we talked about last time. So there may not be a lot of new information here, but I think we're going to give you some flavor of some of the way we're thinking about coding for this district and applying zones in the district. For those of you that are on the land use and the planning committee in Northwest, you'll totally, this is up your alley and you'll totally understand it. For other folks, if you have questions, let us know. So go ahead and cue that slideshow up then, Kate. Oh, I have to say next slide to you then, don't I? Is that right? Okay. I'm just reminding folks, this is the current comprehensive plan, and the area that we're looking at is really mostly north of Vaughan and south of Nikolai. There's the streetcar alignment that we have, and this yellow dashed line represents kind of the outline of that area that we talked about that was in the prime industrial overlay. It actually extends quite a bit further to the north, but this is the area that within our study area that we'd be looking at. Next slide. And just as a reminder, this is the zoning pattern there, which is different than the comp plan. The zoning, particularly in the area that we're looking at most intensely, which is west of Highway 30, has some heavy industrial zoning remaining on the former ESCO site. I don't think you guys can see my cursor, so maybe Kate can outline that. There we go. Former ESCO site and the areas to the north. some lower intensity general industrial to the east of that, right in that area. And then further to the west, there's Montgomery Park, which currently has an EXD zone and comprehensive plan designation. And then to the right of that, or east of that, we have some areas, including the American Can Building and the area between Vaughan and Thurman, that are zoned EG1, which is an employment zone right now. So just refreshing you on that. Next slide. So as we get into the land use pieces, I'm just going to remind folks that we did have some implementation conditions that we talked about at the last meeting that are kind of prerequisites, if you will, to some degree before we would move forward on land use changes. So the changes that I'm going to be describing today are all kind of we're working towards completing a plan, understanding what the development regulations would look like, how we might zone it, but we really have some other steps that we have to kind of go through before we would actually act on that. So for instance, Planning Commission may actually look at the regulations and consider this package, but before we go to City Council, we would certainly have to have some of these other issues addressed. So first, west of Highway 30, we have the prime industrial land issue. We've got probably about 25 acres or so of area that is designated as prime industrial, that current city policy would suggest that we need to either replace that or find a way to mitigate to offset the impact and the loss of that industrial land. So we're still looking at that. And we talked about at our last meeting that there's an economic opportunities analysis that's underway right now that may change the dynamics and the relationships of needs of industrial land. So that may be one avenue to reconciling that issue. Another option might be finding additional land or mitigating via a brownfield fund of some sort or another that would allow cleanup of land that's currently not viable for industrial uses because of contamination or something like that. So that's one issue that we need to get through. Second is we want to make sure that there's some kind of a high quality transit improvement that's moving forward, whether that's streetcar or some other kind of a high quality transit improvement to serve the land use intensity that we're talking about. That's another key piece. And then the third one was that we wanted to come to some kind of a benefits agreement or development agreement with the owners of property in the area that may see a significant increase in value due to zoning changes. And we've talked about that from the beginning, trying to balance the public and private good that's generated by changes in land use. So that might include offsetting for prime industrial land loss, include the streetcar or transportation improvements, which would be benefits that would be immediate to the district. And then could include things like additional affordable housing beyond what might be built through inclusionary housing, affordable commercial space, potentially parks or open spaces or other kinds of public goods. So that's what the benefits agreement is thought to include. East of Highway 30, just as a reminder, we had talked about leaving that as in an industrial comprehensive plan designation and an industrial zone. But potentially making an allowance for a creative or industrial office in that area. And at this point in time, we're pushing the pause button on that one. We're waiting for the EOA to resolve and see if it makes sense to move forward with any of that. So the work that we're doing right now is mostly focused on the area west of Highway 30. Next slide. So as a reminder, I showed you guys this map last time, which just showed kind of how we imagined the zoning pattern in the area working and carving up different areas in terms of what the transition of zoning would be. And so now we've got more refined zone maps that I'm going to share with you next. So next slide. So this map shows the areas that would actually be changing the comprehensive plan designation in to facilitate and implement the project that we're talking about here. So they're outlined in those dark lines. And as you can see, the Montgomery Park site is not identified for zone change. It's already zoned EX, but the area of the American Can Building, Kate, if you could just point to that, and the area between Vaughan and Thurman would go from a mixed employment to an EX zone. The ESCO, former ESCO site would also go from a mixed employment to a EX, central employment zone. And then the area to the west or east of that rather would go from an industrial sanctuary to an EX zone or EX comp plan as well. To the north along Nikolai, there are fewer changes. The only one, this area is already in a mixed employment designation, but up at the northeastern corner, that area is in industrial sanctuary, and that would go from an industrial sanctuary to a mixed employment designation. So that's maintaining that industrial or non-housing buffer adjacent to Nikolai. Next slide. This shows the zoning pattern that would be likely to be implemented with that comp plan approach. And so that just starting with that buffer along Nikolai, we would propose to use an EG1 zone, most likely in that area. That's a general employment zone. It would not include opportunity for housing, but it would allow office and a variety of industrial type uses, but no housing allowed there in keeping with what we talked about last time. Further to the south of that, Montgomery Park again is already EX, but that area of the former ESCO site would go from a heavy industrial zone to a central employment zone with a design overlay applied to it here. The area to the east of that, which is more parcelized between 23rd and 24th, would also go from an IG1 to an EXD zone. And then south of that, between Vaughan and Nikolai, we're also proposing to potentially use the EXD zone. Before I leave these maps, you can't see it on your screen, or maybe you can. I have a note down there that we might consider using CM2 and CM3 mixed use zones in this area rather than EXD. They're very similar zones in terms of the scale of development that we're anticipating. The reason we might consider using the commercial mixed use zones rather than EX is really a matter of they were updated more significantly in the comprehensive plan with new standards for ground floor windows and different types of setbacks and other kind of development standards that are more in keeping with an updated comp plan. EX is used primarily in the central city, and the central city uses the central city plan district, which has a lot of development regulations and provisions that are specific to the central city that are applied to zones like EX and CX. I'll show you in a minute some of the concepts that we're thinking about for our plan district, but many of those concepts would come automatically with use of the mixed use zones. We would have to add them to apply them to EX. So we're still kind of debating that. Want to have some conversations with other stakeholders in the area about which zone might be more appropriate. So next slide. And just to review, just a kind of a couple of examples of what these zones look like and what intensity they are. EX, again, central employment, allows basically 65 feet of height by right. It's mostly oriented towards office and residential uses, but it does allow a variety of industrial uses. So it does have the benefit of any industrial firms that are out in that area would not be non-conforming. They would still be conforming, which is important, particularly to the industrial community. The general industrial zone is kind of general employment zone 1 is a smaller scale zone, slightly. It still would allow anywhere from 45 feet of height to 65 feet of height, depending on how we code that. The big difference there is it would not allow for any housing, so it's really much more of an office and employment and industrial focused zone, and that would be applied along Nikolai. Next slide.
Mike was just saying that there were some questions in the chat. I know I can't see them because I'm
okay.
The screen, but I don't know if you want to pause for a second.
Let me go to the next slide and then we'll take a quick pause.
Okay.
And then I just want to share with you the CM3 zone that we're also kind of potentially considering is a large scale mixed use zone that we've used pretty extensively in outside of the central city throughout Portland in areas that were zoned to CX or EX previously. Northwest Portland has quite a bit of it. It's a fairly large-scale zone allows 65 feet, which is basically a 6-story height limit by right. When housing is developed in the CM3 zone, you get a bonus in terms of FAR, which you also do in the EX zone. But in the CM3 zone, you get a bonus of 10 feet more in height to get to that 7-story, 75-foot height limit that Tyler was discussing as a possible development type that might make sense in this area. So yeah, why don't we pause and we can look at the chat and I can answer a couple questions if there are some.
Barry, can you see the chat, or is it helpful if I just read the questions to you?
It's more helpful if you read. I can see it, but go ahead and read them to me.
Phil had a couple questions about brownfield mitigation, about how much of it is a public responsibility and have brownfields been mapped and responsibility assigned yet?
I don't have complete answer to that, Phil. I don't know that it's a public responsibility, but I don't have a complete answer to that. I don't know if Eric's with us today and could answer that or not. He's got more experience in the area of brownfields. I don't think he is, but we can get back to you on that topic. I think
it's a side topic. It's not really central to the planning process.
Okay. I think it is a good question, though. Other questions that were there?
Sorry, my little one just ran into the room. Mike Stonebreaker asked if we'll include a do nothing, no zone change option in the discussion draft.
We probably won't put that in there as the proposed. We might talk about that as part of some of the alternatives that were considered, but we're not going to focus on that as the way the discussion drafts are typically written. They're aimed at the proposal, so there'll be some mention of some of the scenarios that we considered, which includes a kind of a no change scenario or a baseline scenario, but it would be mostly focused on what the proposed changes would be.
And last, Stephen Ramos, did Barry answer your question about the different uses and FAR?
No, what I'm suggesting is it would be very helpful to have a table that outlines the different uses, FAR, heights, and intensity of development, given each of those different zoning options. In other words, we can see them side by side. What's the impact going to be?
Okay, yeah, I don't have them with me today, but I can get them to you. That wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, because I assume that that's part of what's driving the economic analysis. So it'd be helpful to see.
Yeah, and I can tell you just,
yeah.
Again, we'll get you that table. I can tell you that the FAR and the height between the EX zone, as we're imagining it being applied here, and the CM3 zone, which you should be familiar with in Northwest Portland, pretty similar. The base FAR in both zones is 3-to-1. The maximum FAR with when inclusionary housing is triggered is 5-to-1. The biggest difference between the two zones, the EX and the CM3, is that the EX does not automatically have an additional 10-foot height bonus for the inclusionary housing. It's capped at 65. And the reason for that is it's applied typically in areas where there's a mapped height limit. Central City has height limit maps that are very specific to those different areas that use EX. Outside of the Central City, we don't have as much, except in certain plan districts, of variation in height. So the base zone has an allowance for buildings to go an additional 10 feet when they trigger inclusionary housing. So the max height is 75. But I'll get you a table that shows the comparison.
Thank you.
Other questions while we're paused here? Nope. Okay.
And Brian's raising his hand.
Yeah, I know there was mention on one of the, I think it was the kind of the narrative around the draft recommended option that we're looking at right now. There was mention of 120-foot high as like a possibility. What can you provide, just some context around that, or what, what that's about?
I'm going to get into that in just a second. So if you can just hang on to that question, I'll talk about it.
Yeah, you got it.
So the next slide. So in doing this, I'm just going to show you some maps that, because it will require, we're planning to do a new plan district for this area. That's the way we think would make sense. And a plan district basically has regulations embedded in it that are specific to a certain geography. So Giles Lake, the industrial district to the north, has a plan district called the Giles Lake Industrial Plan District. The Northwest neighborhood has the Northwest Plan District, as you all, or many of you probably know. So our intent would be to create a new one for this specific area because it's kind of an amalgam of both Northwest and Giles Lake areas. It seems somewhat unique. Frankly, both of those plan districts have lots of provisions in them that wouldn't necessarily be entirely applicable here. So we'd have to do a lot of navigation to try to, weave our way in and out of regulations that may or may not apply. So we think creating a new one is the cleanest way. We still would need to amend some that apply in the area, and I'll just show you a couple of those maps. So we would probably need to amend the Giles Lake Plan District boundary to exempt and take out the ESCO and adjacent industrial sites to the east of that. Montgomery Park is not in that plan district right now, so that's not an issue, but we would need to amend that boundary. Next slide. Along with it, we would delete the sub-district B that's in the Giles Lake Plan District because that would no longer apply either. So, and that all of the text that relates to that would be deleted as well. Next slide. In Northwest, we would most likely be amending the map 562.7 in the Northwest Plan District to provide the same kind of regulatory framework along the streetcar alignment on 23rd that we have in the loop on Lovejoy and Northup in 23rd as it exists today. So really we're not necessarily seeing regulatory code changes, but definitely a map change to make this consistent with that. Next slide. So this is the new plan district. Right now we're just calling it the Von Nicolai Plan District, and the beauty of that name is that it's at the end of the alphabet of all of the plan districts, so we don't have to renumber every single code that we have to make it work. So we like that, but so we would create a new plan district that would basically be north of Vaughan and south of Nicolai, would encompass all this area. It would include a sub-district that, and we've included it here, it's that area along Nicolai that would be a buffer. That area might include some regulations that limit office development in there. That's an area that currently office floor area is limited in right now. So we're, again, in the spirit of trying to maintain as much industrial land supply as possible and not run counter to that whole policy issue, we may maintain similar consistent regulations that are in place there for that band, but we're still working on that. Next slide. We would also theoretically apply a similar tool that we have applied to Northwest that would, in this new plan district, that would apply active use development standards around the streetcar, and those could include things like minimum floor area and active building kind of frontages adjacent to the streetcar line. We're still working on fine-tuning this. Obviously, this needs some work because it's overlapping into that industrial area, so or the employment buffer, if you will. So we'll be refining this map a little bit more, but that kind of a concept would apply. Next slide, please. And then this is just a list of some of the concepts that we're thinking about applying, and they've been plucked out of, so to speak, some of the other plan districts that are nearby and that have streetcar or high quality transit in them. So we would probably have some uses that would be prohibited in this district, similar to the Northwest, things like quick vehicle servicing, gas stations and Jiffy Lubes and things like that. Self-service storage, probably not an appropriate use. Outdoor recreation, potentially agriculture. Some uses might be limited in terms of size. We're thinking through this. Retail sales and service, maybe we don't want big box retail being an outright allowed use in here, so we might think about limiting the size of retail. We also might think about whether or not what the role of the industrial uses are in an evolving mixed-use neighborhood. So maybe we don't want to make them non-conforming, but we may not want to introduce large-scale industrial uses and try to maintain a smaller scale. In terms of floor area, if we use the EX base zone or the CM3 for that matter, the base FAR is 3:1. And again, floor area, for those of you that aren't like land use, following land use stuff, floor area means the amount of building area relative to the amount of site area. So a floor area ratio of 1:1 means that on a 10,000 square foot lot, for instance, you could build a one-story building covering that entire lot, or a 10,000 square foot building. If you had a 2:1 FAR, if you had a 10,000 square foot lot, you could build a two-story building equaling 20,000 square feet, and so on. So those are the FARs that the base zone have in them. As I said, in the CM3, there's a 5:1 FAR with the IH bonus. That's true of EX as well. In the area near this proposed streetcar, we're thinking about having some minimum floor area requirements, similar to the way Northwest's plan district is. We have in the CM zones now, we have a residential density minimum, so we would probably apply some of that if for sites that developed residentially. One of the things that is unique to, one of the things about the EX zone that's different than the CM zones or the way the plan district in the central city work is that we have enhanced higher ratios of ground floor windows required in those new zones, in the commercial mixed use zones and in the central city. So we would probably apply a plan district provision that would require similar higher window coverage at the ground floor of new buildings, as well as above the ground floor, particularly in areas near the streetcar alignment. And I already mentioned active use areas near the streetcar. Next slide.
I was just wondering on the active use areas, is that typically, because it says, I know it says earlier, limited uses of retail and sales. Is active use, and maybe you covered that, is that retail or is that, what does that look like?
The way we've implemented that in the past, and we could do something differently, but the way we've implemented in the past is we require that the ground floor of the building be built to a standard that has a certain ceiling height and a certain bay depth and a certain window coverage and is ADA essentially accessible so that it can accommodate a commercial retail use. Typically we don't require a use, but we require that the building be made to accommodate that use because we want to make sure that there's flexibility to accommodate retail or other kinds of things in the future. We don't want to preclude that usually.
Yeah, you don't want people looking at just a big block wall or something.
Correct.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that if the area in the mixed use zones, even residential uses at the ground floor need to be constructed in this way so that they can be converted at a later date.
Okay.
There's some other options in the mixed use zones because, citywide it's a large area, but particularly around the streetcar, it would make sense to try to make sure that we have active uses. And it's not the entire ground floor of the building, but it's a portion of it.
Okay.
Next slide. Again, just want to talk about, we'll touch on that higher height limit option here. If we use the EX zone or if we use the CM3, it's very similar. The base height limit is 65 feet. We would have two kinds of height limit bonuses that we're talking about. One is for inclusionary housing. So if your development has and triggers the inclusionary housing requirements, which is anything over 20 units, you would be entitled to go up an additional 10 feet, up to 75 feet. So that's the same as what the CM3 zone has in it currently without any additional plan district provisions adding to that. So that's kind of a citywide standard. And if we used EX, we think it makes a lot of sense to use that provision here as well. It does, and we'll see this when the opportunities and challenges report comes out, it really makes the housing perform a lot better. We get quite a bit more affordable units this way. And it also increases the overall value that we might be able to capture for public benefit. Now the plan development option is the one that Brian had asked about earlier, and this is something that's currently available in the mixed use zones and in the CM3 zone specifically. On a large site, if you're over 2 acres, you can ask for essentially a master plan, and you would go through the Portland Design Commission and present a master plan that includes site plans and massing, and request heights up to 120 feet. And the purpose for that is that oftentimes on large sites that aren't broken up and parcelized, it's very difficult to utilize the floor area that is allowed within the 65 or 75 foot height limit. On a small lot, it's much more feasible to do that, but when you're up in 2+ acres, it gets kind of difficult because you have circulation internal to the site, or you have other requirements. So the idea would be that one would take this to the design commission. They would review a site plan. It would have public input. It'd be a type 3 review, essentially, including neighborhood, opportunity for input, and could be approved with heights up to 120 feet, but not exceeding the maximum FAR that's allowed in the base regulations 3:1 and 5:1. That master plan, because it is providing additional height, which is a benefit for the property, is also required to provide additional public benefits. The way that what CM3 zone works, the additional public benefits are, making sure that inclusionary housing targets are met for the entire site, providing publicly accessible open space of at least 15% of the site area, so a park or a plaza-like component. And then in that particular plan development for the CM zones, new buildings have to be built to a higher level of energy efficiency. So that's a benefit to tenants as well as owners. So that's the way the plan development option might work. We're still working through that, but you might see something like that in the discussion draft to discuss. Just want a couple more points here. On the Northwest Vaughan frontage across the street, you have CM2 zoning, which is a smaller scale than EX or CM3. We're thinking about trying to do some kind of a height step down so that the scale of buildings on that street are maintained and you don't have big buildings on one side and small buildings on the other side. We would also apply the design overlay zone to all of this area. The new amendments coming out of the DOZA project, Design Overlay Zone Amendment project, has some new design standards, design guidelines, and some process changes. And I just want to point out that projects in the state of Oregon, projects that include housing, have to have what they call a clear and objective path. They can't be completely subjected to discretionary design review, except in the central city and except in Gateway. So projects in this district that include housing would have to have an option for a standards approach, if you will, to meet design standards rather than going through a discretionary review. And the point of this paragraph is that the DOZA project is changing the threshold, if you will, of where that kicks in. Right now, projects over 55 feet have to, let me rephrase it, turn that around. Projects 55 feet and less can meet standards. If you're over 55, you have to go through a discretionary review. They're changing that to say projects 75 feet and less can go through the standards, and 75 and over would have to go through discretionary review. So a slight change there. That is not adopted yet. Next slide. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to just touch on before we close is just this notion about public benefits and how we're thinking about how this pie can possibly be split up. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we have a proposal for that, but this just kind of gives you a sense of how we might think about where we're going with that. If this pie represented the total value generated by zoning changes, there's different elements within that that we need to address. Tyler and the Eco Northwest team has suggested that we need to think about private return on investment to induce the market to actually support the zoning changes and move forward with development in the area. So there's probably some element there. We've talked about mitigation for industrial land supply changes. That might be coming out of the pie of public benefit. Talked about streetcar and transportation system improvements, the LID, that might come out of this pie of public benefit. We've talked about affordable housing. That's come up in most of the reports from the community-based organizations about one of the most desired public benefits that we could supply as more of that, along with affordable commercial space or affordable makerspace. And then that leaves some element over for other kinds of public benefits. I just wanted to share that with you. That's the next step we're getting at, is to try to figure out what that pie looks like and how we might negotiate that in the development agreement. So why don't we close this and take questions? And we can go back to any particular slide you guys want to go back to. Any questions from folks? I see Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I just put something into the chat about the planned development part. Have you identified how many two acre sites would be eligible or where they are?
In this particular plan district?
Yeah.
Well, Montgomery Park would clearly be one of them that could qualify. And depending on how the street pattern works for the ESCO site, ESCO would probably be, or the former ESCO site, some of those sites would be potentially eligible as well. There's a couple of larger parcels up in that band between Nikolai and Vaughan, but I don't foresee any of those being zoned EX and having this provision apply to them. So it's really Montgomery Park and ESCO where that kind of a master plan element could probably be exercised.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Barry, along those lines, if one property owner owns multiple sites adjacent to each other, would that apply? I mean, they're individual tax lots, but somebody owns the entire block, for example.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the way our site plan, it's getting dark where I am, sorry. The way our site regulations are written, yes, a site is considered common ownership of multiple lots, so that could be aggregated, yeah. But you'd still want to kind of synthesize that together and plan for the whole thing. So if there were different similar ownerships but different lots, that could. So, for instance, I think maybe part of the ESCO holding includes a piece between Vaughan and Wilson. And so that probably could be rolled into that master plan. You know, I think the design commission and staff would look at that in terms of their recommendations and think about, you know, what we're trying to achieve in terms of height limits and transitions to neighborhoods. That's part of the plan development criteria, is to look at the surrounding context and try to respond to that in the best way possible, still utilizing the FAR. And the way this kind of evolved was we had some large sites we were looking at when we were doing the comp plan mixed use zones. And the notion was that rather than having like uniform 4-story building maximums in some zones or 6-story building maximums in other zones, that we would allow large sites to go through a process where they could actually better articulate height limits on their site, you know, put the bigger buildings maybe in the middle where there's no impact to adjacent neighbors and taper down at the edges and kind of deal with that. In some cases, there's also existing development on sites that people would like to retain, you know, for historic reasons or other reasons. Those have FAR entitlements that could be transferred to other buildings on the site, and that additional height might give the flexibility to utilize that in a plan development. Phil's got his hand up.
Mine's kind of a rhetorical comment, but thinking about our study area here and the Conway district, which of course is well into development, I'm thinking about future pressures for the area between those two districts, if you will, to infill over time with more intense development. I just think there's going to be a lot of pressure for sort of a mega district in here somewhere. And just to think about what the synergy is between the Conway district and this new Montgomery Park district. Rhetorical comment. There's no answer to that, but
yeah, well, and we can look. We should follow up and look at the zoning map a little bit more closely on what that looks like too, and what might be achievable or doable. Any changes that might be afoot in that area. We haven't proposed any. Other questions or comments, thoughts? We'll have more detail in the discussion draft about all this, but we want to give you a preview of kind of some of the things that we're thinking about. Okay. Nicholas, did you want to chime in? I saw you.
The only thing I was going to ask Barry is, or state is that the planned, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the planned development isn't limited to a single ownership, right? So there's a size, but you could have two, for instance, 2 1-acre property owners come in with a planned development. Isn't that right? A single.
I have to go back and look at how the regulation is written. I'm not sure right off the top of my head.
It's just something to consider.
Yeah, it certainly could be possible. Yeah.
Actually, that was the question I was backing into. There is a property owner on York and 24th who owns several, but I would say he's good friends with the people across the street who also own several. And I'm wondering, I actually think his site is probably about 2 to 3 acres total if he combined them all. But having multiple property owners in one area would be an interesting way to go about that.
Yeah, I just brought it up because that's the way it works in the central city. Is it's not defined by ownership; it's defined by size intentionally. So we just need to think about it.
And another point is that difference here is that in the central city, the master plans that are identified there are required on those sites. And in this instance, we would probably apply it like we've applied it in the commercial mixed use zones, where it would be an option. We wouldn't make you go through one. You could build to the allowed height limits, which are lower, by right. But if you wanted to do something bigger, you'd have to go through the master plan. So Mike, you have your hand up.
Yes, I know it's close to 6, so we're wrapping up. So a lot of information has been shared here. There's going to be the discussion draft coming out, and it'll take a little while to absorb that. So it's hard to come up with questions just on the spot. So having a little bit of time, do you know when, do you have a prediction of when the discussion draft is going to come out, and then amount of time where we could review that and then come together and meet and have that conversation? Have you thought about how all that timing is going to work?
I'm going to still say I'm hoping to get something out for our internal review in the week or two. And that probably will be 3 weeks before it would go out publicly or to the group. So probably 3 weeks from now or so. Yeah, it's going to be a little while longer, probably into February, I'm thinking. And then the discussion draft would go out publicly. So we would certainly want to hear your input on it, but we would take input from the broader public as well.
So were you saying that it's going to go out to us at the same time that it goes out to the public?
That's our thought, yeah.
Okay. And then would we have another meeting? Sorry, I just keep on asking questions now, but then would this group come together and meet again? Or after, at that point, it's every reviewer for themselves and kind of a public?
I think we would probably want to have this group come and discuss it and talk about what works and what doesn't work about it. But I think we'd also be taking the broader public comment at that point in time as well, and sharing with you what we're hearing from multiple stakeholders.
Okay.
And multiple interest parties.
Okay. So you'll let us know when that meeting would be, just to get it on.
Yeah, that meeting would probably be we may have to schedule a special one. I think the next one we're scheduled for is in April. I'll have to look at the timing of it, and we'll follow up with you guys and figure out when we're going to peg that time. So I apologize, I can't be more clear about that right now.
No, it's helpful. Thank you for sharing what you know so far.
Other questions or thoughts at this point? Otherwise, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Okay. All right. Well, that's what we have. Any staff, anything for the good of the order, or anybody else from the public? I forgot. I don't know if we still have Alan with us from the public. No, looks like he's gone. So anybody else for the good of the order before we hang up for today and follow up later?
Enjoy the snow.